I'm Scott MacDonald. I'm a senior and regional analyst here at Intelligence Fusion, and today I'll be talking about the Police Crime Sentencing in Courts Act, which has recently been made into law and has been known over the last year or so as the bill in the Kill the Bill protests across the UK. So the bill at the heart of the Kill Bill protests is kind of widely seen as a radical overhaul of the criminal justice system across England and Wales. It grants police a lot more powers, especially regarding the policing of protests, and that's raised a lot of kind of ethical concerns about the policing of these protests. Protests obviously kind of seen as a fundamental right in a democracy, but I think, from the other side of the coin, there's been a lot of protests in the UK recently that the police have been struggling to deal with, and I think this bill has been introduced in response to that, to try and strengthen their arm, if anything. So I would say over the last couple of years, there's been several key areas of protests that police have been faced with and have kind of really struggled to get to grips with. I would say the first one that is really ongoing still at the moment, and I think there's considerable scope for it to get much larger and much more serious, is environmental and climate change protests. So we've got groups like Extinction Rebellion, Insulate Britain and Just Stop Oil taking really kind of radical direct action, blocking main roads, gas and oil terminals, airports and things like that. In fact, just this morning in Clydebank up in Scotland, Just Stop Oil blocked an oil terminal. I think the scope for this to get worse is there because of the outbreak of war in Ukraine. This kind of led to an energy crisis across the continent. And if anything, it's kind of actually strengthened some of these protesters' arguments for the shift away from fossil fuels, the reliance on oil and gas that the west of Europe actually relies on Russia for. So I'd imagine these environmental climate change protests are going to get much worse over the course of the summer. Another key area I would say has been the actual lockdown restrictions over the last couple of years as well. The COVID-19 pandemic wasn't particularly foreseen very well, so the response to it from a policing perspective was quite ad hoc. So the officers themselves have had the unhappy task of having to enforce these lockdowns, which, while necessary, were not universally popular. And I think the police, as the most visible low-level symbols of the state, have kind of borne the brunt of that. Here at Intelligence Fusion, I wouldn't say it was a coincidence that in the 2 years between March 2018 and March 2020, we recorded 73 instances of attacks on police. And from the first lockdown in March 2020 until the present day, we've recorded 473. So again, I wouldn't have said all of them were strictly related, but I would say the correlation is there to be made. A third area I would say relates to the police struggling to deal with unprecedented protests would be the murder of George Floyd in the United States. So the fallout from George Floyd's murder spread well beyond America and was seen in the UK in the form of mass Black Lives Matter protests. I think the most notable of which occurred in Bristol, the toppling of the statue of Edward Colston. Some of those protesters, known as the Colston Four, then went on to court and have since been found not guilty by a jury. I would also add in the murder of Sarah Everard by a serving Metropolitan Police officer. Not only did that seriously harm the reputation of all police officers across the UK, but the subsequent policing of the vigil for Sarah Everard in London was quite badly handled. A number of arrests were made, and again, just like the Colston Four, those protesters then went on to court, and the court actually came down in favour of the protesters and found that the police had actually infringed their rights, their freedoms to freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. So we've seen in these instances a number of almost unprecedented challenges in the form of protests to the police across the UK, and officers have kind of been struggling to respond to it. I think this new act has the potential for solidifying the decrease in trust, respect and lines of communication between the public and the police. If people feel like the voices aren't going to be heard, then there's a concern that they're going to stop dialogue with the police. One of the good things about policing in this country is that it relies heavily on the kind of Peelian principles, whereas all police officers are citizens that just happen to be in uniform. I think the strengthening of this bill would maybe lead to concern that kind of trust and special relationship between the police and and members of the public could be eroded. I think, there's probably a real concern of that. I think there's certain elements of the Act that actually have quite widespread support. I don't think the case could be made that the entirety of this Act is there for criticism. One of the actual changes now is the mandatory life sentence for the murder of a police officer. So I think that's something that would actually have quite universal popular backing. The introduction of this Act shouldn't be viewed in isolation. Its introduction and passage actually comes at an interesting time for policing in the UK. So we've touched on Sarah Everard and the vigil, the arrests made at the vigil of Sarah Everard. That particular incident led to a massive fallout between the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, and the Commissioner, Cressida Dick. Cressida Dick has essentially been ousted since that. That incident has led to a fallout between the Mayor of London himself and the Home Secretary, Priti Patel. But aside from these external factors, there's also significant internal problems within policing at the minute. The Police Federation of England and Wales has expressed no confidence in the Home Secretary herself. The chairman of the Police Federation has actually quit himself on allegations of sexual misconduct. The kind of much lauded recruitment of 10,000 police officers across England and Wales kind of belies the fact that it doesn't even quite bring back police officer numbers to where they were a decade ago to catch up for government cuts and the number of officers that have since retired. And there's also the fact that police have not received a pay rise in 2021, whereas nurses and firefighters actually did. You would have assumed that all emergency services were going to get a pay rise following the pandemic, but that's turned out not to be the case. So, yes, some of the wording of the Act itself, in terms of moving on and kind of removing protesters from certain scenes, is quite vague, and that could actually be criticised. I think it's certainly one of the major criticisms of it, because they're so vague, it actually gives police an extraordinary amount of power over protests and when and where to take action. The only thing I would say, with experience of having been a special constable, is that on the flip side, an extraordinary amount of power is given to police officers in the terms of discretion. Just because a police officer has the power to do so, it doesn't mean they are actually going to do so. One of the interesting facets of being a constable is that the power resides within that officer himself. It has to satisfy his requirements that an offender has broken the law. He cannot be compelled by a senior officer to essentially go in and remove a protester unless he has satisfied himself that the law has been broken. I think it will be very interesting in the next few months, over the course of the summer, with the ending of the lockdown restrictions, the better weather, and the general increased likelihood of protests. Just a few days ago it was the 1st of May, very popular across the continent in terms of anti-kind of government sentiment, labour protest and so on. So I think, given all those things, and as mentioned, the energy crisis unfolding across Europe, I think the potential for vastly increased protests across Europe is there. I think it's certainly going to happen. In terms of the UK, I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this Act is actually put into force. It's only come into effect a few days ago. It's also worth mentioning, obviously, that this Act only applies really to England and Wales. We've talked about how Just Stop Oil are protesting today in Clydebank up in Scotland. So another idea is, how are the concepts from this new Act going to be put into practice across the rest of the UK, in Scotland, for example, in Northern Ireland. It would be interesting to see whether these devolved governments are going to introduce their own legislation that would mirror this. If I had to have a hunch, I would say they would. But I would imagine what they'll actually do is wait and see how it goes into effect in England and Wales, first of all, before they take that kind of action. But yes, from a kind of intelligence point of view, I would definitely say increased protests are likely across Europe on all kinds of fronts, but particularly, I think, on environmental and climate change. And we'll just have to wait and see how this act strengthens police in the UK to take action if necessary. Because at the end of the day, the role of the police is actually to facilitate protests. They're not actually there to get in the way or hamper.
Thanks for watching that episode of The Insight. If you found this episode interesting, subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you don't miss out on future episodes.